What is your goal for public policy?
One of the things we as a group really feel passionately about is empowering people to do what they can with the resources they have in the position they are in. There's a way you can have an impact with your level of expertise and your desire and your knowledge and your perspective.
Welcome to the My ABA Mentor podcast. My name is Brianne, and I'm going to be your host for today. And I am hosting the Public Policy Posse. Does everyone say hi, hi, hi?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. Several amazing women here who are doing awesome work in our field, and we are going to be talking to them today about their new article, Why Public Policy Matters, a Call to Action for the Everyday Behavior Analyst. They are a collective of dedicated behavior analysts, and they are committed to inspiring change and rallying professionals to influence public policy and uphold ethical business practices. With over 50 years of experience in the field and more than 90 years in advocacy, we bring a wealth of knowledge and passion to our mission. We believe that every individual in our field is an advocate and representative empowered to excel. Our messaging, infused with humor, strives to disseminate crucial messages and tools, equipping every behavior analyst with the skills, means, and connections to make a difference, most importantly. So, nationally recognized for our impact, we have been honored to present at several national conferences, published in Behavior Analysis in Practice, and we're part of the group awarded for Excellence in Advocacy Award at the Autism Law Summit. And by the way, they are just getting started and they have lots more to do. The group sits on public policy committees for COABA, CASP, and the APBA, among others nationwide. They have also successfully advocated for Medicaid rate improvement, medically necessary services in schools through the HB 1260 bill, and successfully advocated to remove policy barriers within their state of Colorado. Wow. So amazing work, basically in one sentence. So grateful to have you guys doing such awesome work out there in the field. I'm going to do a quick intro for each person because we've got 4 women here, all powerful in their own rights. So first up, we have Rebecca. And Rebecca is the owner of 7 Dimensions Behavioral Health and Day Treatment Center. She is also the president of COABA. Next up, we have Emily. She is the executive director and co-owner of Step in Autism Services, and she addresses funding challenges for quality care. She is the public policy committee chair for COABA. Next, we have Alexandra, and she is the Director of Clinical Standards at Blue Sprig, and she oversees clinical quality and standards there. And she is also the chair of COABA Professional Development Committee and leads workshops and webinars while supporting public policy initiatives. And last but finally not least is Beth, and she is the owner of Clear Path Behavioral Solutions, and she provides mentorship and support for BCBAs and small ABA companies. She is also the founder of Over the Rainbow Behavioral Consulting, providing ABA services to rural families in Colorado. She is the secretary of COABA, and she is also a dedicated advocate for children with disabilities, developmental delays, and their families. So welcome. I know that was a mouthful for all of you guys. Such great accomplishments. And I'm so honored and privileged to have you guys on our podcast today. And I will say that you have the most amazing shirts that I've seen on your website. You should definitely go check them out because you should not be crying in the shower and go out and advocate for some public policy. Okay. So if you don't have a shirt, advocate for that because we need to spread the word about how important being involved in public policy is. Today, we're going to be talking primarily about the article that you guys recently published this year. And that article is Why Public Policy Matters, a call to action for the everyday behavior analyst. So I had the privilege to read your guys' article, and there were some really, really amazing points that you guys had made that we're going to talk about today. And the most important thing that I feel that I got from it was actual action steps, right? So it wasn't just a theoretical, like, oh, think about that and think about this and do this. It was like, no, what do we do today, like right now? So why don't you guys just start with telling me a little bit about how you define public policy?
That's a big one. So, public policy would be any rule, law, regulation, contract, any agreement that you have which influences the way that you practice, the way that you do things within your setting.
Perfect. And now, why is this so important for people to know?
It matters because, again, we're behavior analysts, and so we have to look at the practical application of what we're doing. And so public policy, if you look at the fact that Beth defined it as laws, rules, regulations, contracts, agreements, we ethically have to uphold any agreements that we enter. And so it's not only important, it's critical that we understand what the laws, regs, contracts, etc. state, so that way we can ethically practice. You also have to understand where your limitations are, so that way you know where to advocate for change.
Yep. Yeah.
And I would add to that those contracts, agreements, laws that we agree to do shape our behavior, our industry as a whole, not only today, but in the future. So when you agree to a contract or a service provision that you know is not okay, does not actually support that client, that facility, whatever, you're telling that individual that that's okay. They can limit your service, they can limit your practice, they can define what it is you are allowed to do, you are not allowed to do. And when you do this, they then take that and try to push that off on other people, and it grows and it develops and it becomes this beast that then we later are going, oh my goodness, they passed this horrible law that does these horrible things to our industry, and now we have to fight it against it. But that didn't just come out of thin air. That came from the agreements and the contracts and the statements that people made and agreed to before it became a hard law, before it became a hard regulation. And so it's really important that we don't sign contracts, that we don't enter into agreements, because that is what is easy to do at the time. And I as a provider, have been providing ABA services for over 15 years. There have been a lot of contracts and a lot of agreements come across my desk that were not okay, and we had to discuss and talk about and work through. And I think it's important that we do this, that we understand that it's that if we only take the easy road because we're overworked, we're overburdened, life is hard, we are impacting the entire industry, and we have a responsibility to make sure that the impact we have on our industry is a positive one.
Right, shaping, just like you said. But rather than letting the funders shape our behavior, we need to be shaping their regulations and their behavior. And ignorance is not a valid excuse.
Right.
I am notorious for red penning my contracts that come across my table. I am that squeaky wheel when it comes to insurance. If I see something, I'm like, ooh, that's not realistic, and this is why, and I'll go, find the research or whatever to cite back to negotiate taking things out of my contract or revising particular language in my contract. You have to read your contracts very carefully. And I know they're long and they're filled with legal jargon, but that's where your attorney can help you. I mean,
Yeah.
My attorney has become a great friend because we do so much together. I
So
mean,
BFF attorney. Okay, check. Everyone got that. Make sure you have an attorney that's your best friend.
make sure you have an attorney that knows the fields, not
Yep.
just a general standard one. Plug for the
Yes.
Autism Legal Resource Center.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, much different to, regular contracts and much different than our contracts. So what I hear you saying is that this is a process over time that kind of evolves and gets us to where we are today, and where we are in the future. So I do want to hear kind of each one of you, because you have taken such a predominant stand in this area of public policy. How did you get to the point of where you are now? And, where did this passion come from in you guys?
So I am a parent of a child with profound developmental delays. Not a child anymore, an adult with profound developmental delays. When he was about 2, 3 years old, um, he was self-injurious and at a level that we went to top dollar medical professionals in 5 different states trying to find help for him, and we're told we just need to be prepared to institutionalize him. Um, and then we moved to a state that actually provided some ABA services, and they helped shape and fix this for us. And so since that time, and really even prior to that, I've been advocating. I think you'll find all of us have been advocating since childhood for various different things. But that really kind of opened my eyes up to the importance of high quality services for children with disabilities. And when I moved to the state of Colorado, there was no funding for services. They hadn't there were no clinics in my area. People really had no idea what ABA therapy was in the area that I live in. And so that really started the journey and started the advocacy. Because, you know, my child would be in a completely different place. And he would have really not have the choices, the options, the things that he has, had we not found good quality providers, had we not had funding for it, had we not had regulations for it, had there not been insurance contracts for it in the state that we had lived in during that time. And so that really started my battle here in the state of Colorado to try to help really build from the ground up systems.
Yeah, fantastic. Emily, do you want to share a little bit of your story?
Yeah, I really got into public policy when I became a company owner. We founded our company in 2010, so it's been 14 years, and we were up in Fairbanks, Alaska, which is a pretty rural area. It's pretty remote, not a lot of services, so we kind of had to start everything from the ground floor. And there weren't any regulations or information about ABA at the state level. There was barely much at the federal level. And so I just got to see how impactful it was to get in front of those decision makers and educate them. I think a lot of the challenges that we see in poor public policy decisions is because the people that were making the decisions really didn't understand everything that needed to be understood. There weren't experts out there that were sharing the stories that needed to be shared and all of the intricacies that allow for quality service provision. And so it was kind of cool up in Alaska where legislators are accessible to be able to connect with them and see how impactful that is.
Nice. Awesome. And Alex, how about you?
Yeah, for lack of being as eloquent as these other ladies, I just don't sit still well. And I think the quote, when you ask that question, I kind of give a different answer every single time when I'm asked. But a lot of what led me to these women is just being kind of angry about how Colorado Medicaid was going and wanting to do something about it. And I went back to when you asked the question, a West Wing quote, and its decisions are made by those who show up. And that's hugely important. If I can sit there and I can be angry about what's going on, I can gripe and complain to my coworkers or my boss, or I can take that energy. I can still complain. Like venting is important, but I can take the bulk of that energy and I can get in the room. I can have the conversations. I can get engaged in understanding what the policy is or the law is and the pathway to making change. And I can show up and be a part of the change. So that's a lot of how I have come into being engaged in public policy or in any field, whether it's ABA or I've done a lot of work with school boards too. I want to be part of the group that's in the room helping make the decisions rather than just being on the sidelines complaining about the decisions.
Yeah, great. I think that's how a lot of people feel, but then that kind of stops there, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this is such a problem. I'm so upset about this, whether you're a parent or you're a provider. And then you say, well, now what?
Yeah,
Now
it's
what do I
hard.
do? And not being able to be connected or not knowing what to do,
Mhm.
is a barrier. Or even, what I feel like people are like afraid to do. They're
Mhm.
like, oh, I don't want to be, the one with my hand up, or I don't want to go
Yep.
up to the microphone at the council hall or whatever, and be that person, which probably prevents, a lot of people from getting their voice heard. And as professionals, it's so important for us to be the voice for people because we are out there, and it is our responsibility. And obviously, we're not all very shy people here in this room. So we're not too afraid to just walk up and be like, screw that, you're trying to screw us over, you know what I mean? And just say what it is. So I appreciate your perspective, even,
Mhm.
just being real about it and how you feel. Rebecca, how about you?
I was born with a natural gift of stubbornness. So that's really what brought me here. My mom will tell you stories. She tells me stories all the time. Now that I'm in advocacy professionally, she always brings up like you always advocated for people who were being othered. Like stories around. I wrote an angry letter apparently when I was like 4 or 5 to some large cereal company or something because of false advertising because the toy that they sent after I saved all the box tops was a piece of shit. And I was really upset about it. She said I wrote a very angry letter and that I wanted to essentially sue them before I knew what that meant. Um, and there was always this homeless man that was near the grocery store, and my mom would force me to go to the grocery store with her, and I would try really hard to embarrass her every time so I could get out of it, and it never worked. But I was allowed one special treat, and she tells me stories about how if the homeless man was there, I would give him my special treat that I picked from the store.
Oh,
Um, I've also never shied away from these tough conversations. I was painfully shy growing up, but what has always brought me out of my shell is advocacy. When I look backwards, like I at my high school advocated for free condoms
mm,
because of pregnancy issues in the 90s. Just dated myself. It wasn't socially acceptable in a small town to
yeah.
advocate for condoms for free in locker rooms. And we also, as a group, organized a safe sex presentation where there were protesters. So apparently, I've been controversial for a long time. I mean, I participated in protests for like there was a discriminatory law in California that they were trying to pass regarding immigration, and so I was involved in the protest. Like,
Yeah.
just I don't know. I was taught to speak my mind,
Yeah.
regardless of what the outcome is.
Yeah. Great. Great. And we need people like you. We need that the loud voice to make change. And you know it's not everybody's role, and that's real. It's not everybody's going to go out there and make the charge. For those who feel, compelled to do so, we need to be able to empower those people, and we need to be able to educate those people on what to do and how, right? So, what is your goal for public policy as a collective and everything that you're doing with your public policy posse?
You brought it up a couple times just now, and I want to go back to it because I think it is one of our goals is to empower everyone to do what they can in the role that they are in the position they are in, and within their comfort level. You don't have to be the person in the room to impact advocacy, and that's a lot of what we put into our article is you can impact advocacy in a day-to-day job where you don't even go to the state capital level or even listen to recordings of hearings, but you're impacting public policy in your day-to-day work. And I think one of the things we as a group really feel passionately about is empowering people to do what they can with the resources they have in the position they are in. And it doesn't matter if you're an RBT just barely getting into this field, or if you're a seasoned BCBA who's been around for 40 years, there's a way you can have an impact with your level of expertise and your desire and your knowledge and your perspective.
You mentioned, those action things that you guys can do for in your paper, what you call the everyday behavior analyst. So how do you define this person who in your paper and just kind of collectively and why they're important?
I could talk about this all day. I'm trying to give other people an opportunity.
Go for it.
The everyday behavior analyst is a behavior analyst. It is the behavior analyst who is out on the street working with these families and helping these individuals. It's people in other countries who are practicing behavior analysis who may not be board certified because it's not available in their state. It's really anybody in this field who is utilizing the science of applied behavior analysis to create change, whether that be for a single individual or a large group of people. And so what we really would like to see is that these everyday behavior analysts use our science to align their everyday practices to ethical applications and processes and make decisions, make agreements, make contracts based upon what we know is right from our science.
Perfect. So the paper opens with the understanding that behavior analysis is shaped by public policy in the past. We talked a little bit about that just in our intro, but can you tell us about a time this occurred and specifically what we can learn from it moving forward?
Yeah, public policy is in our history, right? And so each aspect along the way, as we talked about earlier, it's all shaping. And so as we have started the field, we're relatively new as a field. And so all these decisions are coming kind of rapidly from when Skinner was practicing and then moving forward through the founding of the ABA board and so on and so forth. So there's all these decisions that are being made that have developed where behavior analysis is as a field from the public policy viewpoint. And so how do the legislators view our field? How do families view our field? And it all impacts how policies are written and what the expectations is on what our field should look like, what our practices should look like, and what we need to be able to provide some quality practice. I think we all have people that we look to as shapers in our field, Gina Green, Rebecca Womack, Dan and Lori Unum. They have all done such incredible advocacy that has really shaped what policies are in place and where our field stands at this time. But looking beyond that, each practitioner who is implementing protocols and writing plans go to a reviewer that they are then working in their management, and then the management is talking with upper management and writing policies based on all of these things. So if reviewers are constantly getting the exact same protocols that are being pushed through to work on something that maybe is not really behavior analytic in nature. That's going to go up the chain and it's going to shape how people are responding to those specific protocols. So, I mean, it's just so systemic that we all kind of have to work together and be aware. And I think it ties back to that concept of the everyday behavior analyst is we're all responsible for where this field goes because we're still a baby field and every motion that we put into play has an enormous impact.
Every contract you sign, you know, right? I mean, and you asked about tell about a time where we did this. I mean, I think getting the law passed in Colorado for medically necessary treatment in schools is an example. And from that, we were able to get Medicaid to reverse their decision of not covering ABA in schools. That was one of the big pieces that was missing because they used to. And then randomly in 2019, they're like, we just don't do this anymore. And that's when I called Dan Unum and said, hey, can I hire you? And can we work on this? And then, like all great romances, we all slid into each other's DMs and started working on this together. Like, and just, you know, a group of pissed off providers trying to fight for the families that were getting screwed.
Yeah, absolutely. So where is everything with that bill as it stands?
So it is in implementation, and there's a mixed result, unfortunately. So we are working with Colorado Department of Ed right now, with Representative Froelich and of course Dan Unum and our lobbyist Emma Hudson to help educate these state agencies to better understand the difference between educational services and clinical ABA. And so we've done some work around defining that. And this is actually going to be an upcoming book that we're going to be writing because Dr. Bailey convinced us it's way too much info for a paper.
Yes.
Yeah, who knows what that's going to look like. But right now we're working with CDE and they're updating their guidance to help clarify policies for the school districts. We've got some districts in compliance and a lot that are not based on the policies that they have developed. A lot of districts have decided that the IEP team gets to decide if it's medically necessary, but that technically violates the law, the language of the law. And so that is where we have to clarify is who gets to determine medical necessity. And it's the medical provider, which is the licensed medical provider in the state of Colorado. That would be their primary care physician, their psychologist, etc.
Gotcha. So it sounds like a big work in progress, but definitely going in the right direction.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we've met with the Attorney General's office as well. They seem to understand where the discrepancies are. So it's very encouraging.
Yeah. So what I have seen just over the years is, the dissemination of the right information about ABA is crucial to making things like this happen, because you have to educate people and you have to understand that not everybody knows what we do and not everybody knows the impact that we have on families and what we can do in a clinic and what we can do in school and what we can do in the community and how those things are different, and what does that look like, and each individual is even different, right? And so I feel as though educating is such a huge part of what we're doing, just to everyone, even to parents, right? Because we go in to families' homes and they're like, oh, my doctor said I needed ABA, but I'm like really not really sure what you do, and if the parent doesn't know, the legislators don't know, it leaves it up to us to start educating people and really telling the story of real ABA. And that's something that you guys talk about in your paper, is the storytelling. And so I want to hear a little bit about that process and how the misperception of stories occurs and how it shapes public policy as we see it.
And there are some articles out there, they're cited in the papers. If anyone gets really passionate about this, there is a place to go with that information that really talks not just about storytelling from a public policy perspective, but storytelling from an ABA perspective. We have issues with our jargon and the perceptions from some of the words we've chosen to describe our science, which from an academic lens, who cares? We call it this so we can understand between fellow behavioral scientists what we're talking about. And that's what we need to do as we're talking in a scientific way. But when you go to translate that to the end consumer, it would be similar to me talking to my husband who is in the military and him just like rattling off all this jargon and acronyms and all that, which is a thing in the military for anyone who's military connected. And I can't understand a word of what he says. And so I'm lost. I'm out. I'm checked out and I couldn't care less. So when we take it from this academic lens where we're learning and we really have to deeply understand the science to the applied setting where we have to work with stakeholders who are completely outside of our field. And oftentimes those who are outside of our field are the most important people to the treatment process, hint, the caregiver and the client. We need to do better about communicating what our science can do, what it is doing when we are actively collecting data and implementing treatment, and what the greater impact of that is. Policymakers do not care that we saw a reduction in problem behavior by 10%. They care more that the child for the first time waited in line for their McDonald's meal and the parent didn't stress because they were worried about having a meltdown. They want to hear the story about the child's first word and how that impacted the family. They don't want to hear that, skill acquisition is about, 2 or 3 targets per week. That's great from us as a scientific perspective. We do need to collect that data. It's important, but that's not the story that's going to impact the greater field. And with so much love, that's not the story that's going to impact the caregiver either. So that's what we mean by when we talk about the misperception or the struggle we have as a science with storytelling. And we just need to be better. We need to be better storytellers with our caregivers and when we're doing policy work.
And also work with insurance and justifying our recommendations. They have to understand how those assessment scores manifest in daily life. What does that change actually look like rather than, well, now he's a level 3 on the VB map? Like nobody understands that. Nobody cares because does it matter that this kid knows what a goat is? Maybe the fuck not. So we have to consider what's actually socially significant and tell those stories in all aspects. Like you have to do it in advocacy and you also have to do it when you're demonstrating medical necessity. You have to do it when you're collaborating with the IEP team, etc.
And this is very different than wordsmithing because I think we get into this weird place of wordsmithing our goals so we can get around policy. And that's not what Rebecca's talking about. What Rebecca's talking about is finding a way to describe what is going to make the difference for this child with words that are understandable by people who are potentially outside of our science. But ideally, you have a peer reviewer who understands the science of ABA and will understand it. But finding ways to describe that in a way that still aligns with policy. You should not try and hide things that are outside of policy. That's not at all what we need to do. But find a way to describe it so that they know why this specific target or this specific protocol is the thing that's going to make the difference for the family and that child in long-term quality of life.
And I think another thing that is really important here is really know your audience and know what the message is for the story that you are trying to tell. If we go back to talking about House Bill 1260 and all of the challenges that come with trying to delineate between medical necessity and educational access, we don't want to choose stories and examples that are going to confuse the issue for those decision makers. We want to find simple, clear examples that paint the picture on what is that difference and why does it matter. And so really taking the time to assess what does my audience member need to come out of this storytelling experience with, and make sure that that story and that example that you're choosing aligns with that message.
So what are your guys' thoughts just on the ethics code? We have the guidance from the BACB for testimonials, things like that. Tell me a little bit more about your thoughts of how those two can work together.
Be honest and be transparent, and you're probably working within the confines of your ethics code.
Right. Well, and just remember HIPAA. Like, like don't violate HIPAA. And, if you're going to use specific information, you need to research what kind of releases you need on file for that. I mean, I have an advocacy video that I shot with a friend of mine that happens to work for Amazon Web Services, very lucky. But I had to jump through so many hoops to get the permissions in place to be able to do that and to let a family tell their story. This family volunteered and wanted to be involved, but you still have to go through all the steps to make sure you have everything in place. Like you got to dot your I's, cross your T's. And that's part of being just having integrity, right? And I feel like that's kind of the underlying foundation of our ethical code.
Yeah. Is there a good resource or guidance for people to get that information out ethically, responsibly, and meeting all those requirements? I know I threw you off with a new question.
Yeah, I don't know one-stop shop because you're going to find that state laws are different and like the ethical code applies everywhere. But even when we're getting to the point of advocating within a peer review for a client beyond HIPAA, and if we're advocating with a payer as you're doing rate negotiations, that's a whole different set of rules and regulations. And what Rebecca was talking about is like going to the media and being able to post something on social media. That's completely different than going and testifying in front of your local budget committee where you may or may not need different permissions in order to be able to say certain things. So I think it's not a resource. I think the thing that I would direct people to do is start with Googling, this is the story I want to tell. What things do I need to make sure I have put into place? What consents do I need to have on file such that I have fulfilled my duty to get informed consent to do this specific type of statement, publicity, testimony, whatever it is, but be specific when you're searching because I don't think there's a one-stop shop for that.
No, Google that shit. GTS. I think you can
consult your lawyer.
Yep, attorneys.
I think that's one of the things I notice about small business providers is they don't understand, they don't think about all the different kinds of attorneys you need. You need attorneys to help guide you to make sure that you are following the laws, that you're practicing where you need to be practicing, even if it's just a 1-hour consult.
Yeah, for sure. Great. So we're gonna change direction just slightly with the next part of your guys' paper where you're talking about the general accepted standard of care. And so you talk about how important this is for people to know. So can you give me a little bit about why that's important and what it is?
I mean, it's a grouping of documents that dictate how we should be practicing. And it's a fantastic reference tool. The one we have cited in our paper is for CASP is actually the second edition, but they did come out this year with the third edition. And honest to goodness, because of my role, I keep my printed copy on my desk right next, like it's here in my hands for those of you who aren't watching or recording. But this is a fantastic reference for when I'm getting a question like, hey, this is coming up with discharge. I'm not quite sure what we need to do. Like there's one thing for me to go and base it on my years of experience and say, this is what I think we should do. It carries so much more weight when I can flip to whatever page it is in this document and be able to say, this is what leaders in our field have said is the standard for this specific clinical process. And it doesn't just include the CASP guidelines. The model coverage policy includes everything for CPT codes and how to bill, what we can and cannot do. So when a payer comes to you or an employer comes to you and says, hey, I want you to build this for this, you can say, actually, that's not true to the letter of the code. That's not the spirit of the code and how it was written. So no, ethically, I can't do that. And you have the ability to point to these documents that don't just guide you or your organization, they guide the entire field.
Right. And this is exactly where you pull your information when you have to push back against a funder. Right. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have gone and just directly cited the generally accepted standards of care from CASP to the reviewer, especially when they say things like, ooh, your DRI replacement behaviors need to be functionally equivalent. And I'm like, that's not in Cooper. Can you point to me, like, where is that in existence within your policies? And they're like, well, it's just a generally accepted standard of care. And I said, I have the document in front of me. What page?
Yeah.
And then, of course, they're like, well, it's unwritten. And I said, but it's not. The generally accepted standards of care are written, and it's in this document. I think we also need to remember to look at beyond that, like NPI, your taxonomy code. There is a massive issue in our country where people are misclassifying themselves as board certified behavior analysts when they do not fit that definition. That is federal fraud. But that is a rampant issue across all states. And it's a massive issue in Colorado because our own state department in credentialing is not confirming whether or not the person using the BCBA taxonomy code actually has the qualifications, whether it's through the QABA or the BACB. We had found, what was our percentage, guys? 34% on the first review, 34% misclassification in this state. That comes out to about $41.5 million in the PBT budget.
Yep.
And yet we're looking at a $20 million cut.
Wow.
Yeah.
And another thing that I just want to mention about the gas is this is a doc when we're talking about the general accepted standards of care that CASP put out. The CASP is a trade association, and they went through a rigorous public comment period and got feedback from members of the provider community and the stakeholders at a more broad level. This isn't just a document that was written by a few people. And so it's a consensus among our field. So there are other documents that we have seen funders point to as generally accepted standards of care. And that's the difference, is it's not written by a small group of people. It is the consensus of the field. It went through a rigorous public comment period, and it is done by a trade association that is a nonprofit organization. I think that's important for people to understand that difference.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, Rebecca, you mentioned that there's a lot of misclassification and all these kind of a little bit crazy things going on. Do you believe that there is a misalignment just in general with the general accepted standards of care? And how does that impact everyone?
I mean, there definitely is misalignment. I mean, Emily just touched on that. There are other groups where it's much smaller amount of individuals who have a shared belief. There's one out there that believes that lower dosage is more effective. And so they're trying to create their own separate standards, but it's not a consensus and it doesn't align with the majority of the research. And so I think that's where the misalignment and confusion is coming in, is you have different groups with different agendas and different motivations trying to state that their standards are the right standards. And that's got to be incredibly confusing for the insurance companies who don't practice behavior analysis.
Right.
And, like it's published. Therefore,
tying it back to the everyday behavior analyst, when you have a provider who says, this is the way we're going to do it because this is the way we do it, and doesn't tie those decisions back to the generally accepted standards of care, doesn't tie those decisions back to our actual science and research, that sends a message to funders, to parents, to other organizations, to other types of service providers collaborating with that individual, that, oh, this is what ABA is, this is what it's supposed to be, and yet it doesn't align. So, it's important for us as an industry to make sure that we all understand the generally accepted standards of care, where they come from, the science behind them, et cetera. But it is important for us as a provider that we make our decisions and that we set our policies and procedures and make our treatment recommendations based off of that science. Again, not because it's convenient or easy for our clinic or works best for our team or or frankly, for the convenience of the family. We have to make sure that we are aligning, that every behavior analyst independently is aligning their decisions and their actions with those standards.
Right. It's learning how to demonstrate medical necessity. It's learning how to determine dosage rather than allowing your company to dictate that we only do a 20-hour-a-week model or a 40-hour-a-week model. That does not align with generally accepted standards of care at all. It deviates from it. And that's where we as providers need to do better.
For sure, for sure. So you mentioned medical necessity and making sure that we're in alignment with that. Can you go into a little bit about medical necessity? What does that mean? And you talk about it also in your paper.
There's lots of definitions of medical necessity. The states and the federal government all have their own definitions of medical necessity. The funders usually define medical necessity in their own right. And then our field has a definition. But ultimately, what we have to look at as providers is what is this individual's diagnosis that we are aiming to address with the science of behavior analysis? What is that diagnosis? What are the symptoms that they are experiencing? And how are our protocols addressing those symptoms and that diagnosis? So ultimately, you really have to be able to tie back what you're doing to that medical diagnosis, since we are operating within the realm of a medical service. We're billing medical insurance. We are using healthcare coverage, and healthcare regulations are generally covering our services. If you are operating outside of that, then this section doesn't really apply to you. However, when you're talking about that aspect of applying behavior analysis, you need to understand what the individual's diagnosis is, what is their symptomology, and how is your science and the application of that science addressing those things.
Which, brings us to the next question that I have for you when we're talking about medical necessity and what does that look like? And, taking into account all the variables of the service that you are providing, there's a big area of need in our field to look at the difference between medical necessity ABA, between going to a clinic and an education setting. Rebecca, you mentioned it just a little bit ago, of plug your book here for for the difference between ABA in clinic and in school. So what guidance can you give to the everyday behavior analyst on what does this look like? How do you determine, what the two differences are, and how does that drive your medical necessity for the families we service?
I think it's really important that the everyday behavior analyst, or the boots on the ground behavior analyst, as I refer to them, you need to educate yourself on the difference in the regulations between educational services and medical or clinical services. The education laws only require, and this is intentionally because we have to define and clearly separate the buckets for funding, right? To be able to track it. It requires that schools provide services which improve access to education. It's not about remediating or ameliorating symptoms of a diagnosis, which is your medical definition, right? So you can see that it's two paths with two different goals. One is to access education so that they can learn, which is admirable and absolutely needed. And then the other is the bigger picture, right? And so one is broader, the other is very small in scope by design, because the schools don't have the funding to remediate or ameliorate medical diagnoses, and they shouldn't be expected to, but they have for decades, which is criminal. Why are medical insurance companies not paying for these services? Because I'm sorry, the autism isn't left in the backpack on the hook at the door. It's ridiculous to assume, well, just because they're in school, sorry, you don't need ABA there. Well, no, you need it everywhere for it to work. And you actually have to assess for generalization issues to determine whether or not ABA is medically necessary in school. We've been working on an assessment tool to help guide practitioners to determine whether or not ABA in school is medically necessary, because rightly so, that's the biggest fear of school districts, is that they're going to have services in the school when they aren't medically necessary and they're actually just for scheduling convenience. And that was not the purpose of the law, and that's not the purpose of our science. Our science is about helping our clientele achieve maximal gains and not need us, ideally, if we can get there, right? I mean, our goal is to help them become functioning members of society and address things that are socially significant to that individual and their caregivers.
Right. How do you guys recommend, or what are your thoughts around getting this to be consistent across states and even internationally? Because it's such a systemic issue, really has to start somewhere. And then, just like in all things, it has to generalize to everyone else so that we are all being consistent. And you talk about this in your paper. So share with us your thoughts about how we can possibly even see that reality.
I think you have to start with a common language. And what we're proposing is that the generally accepted standards of care is that common language. It gives us the foundation that we are advocating from. So if the everyday behavior analyst, in whatever capacity they are advocating, in whatever state or country they are advocating, if they are adhering to those generally accepted standards of care and they are familiar and fluent in them, then the advocacy across all of those different venues is aligned. And ultimately, that will lead to more alignment at a greater scale, because each pocket has the same message.
So another area you guys speak about in your paper is the pigeonholing that we have seen in our field, and what that has done, in regards to policy and access to care and all the things that kind of are tied to that single diagnosis. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by pigeonholing? How has that affected policy and treatment as well?
So I'll take that one. This is something I'm really passionate about. And part of the reason I'm really passionate about this is that my son does not have autism. He has a genetic diagnosis. We know what it is. All of his behavioral tendencies definitely align with that diagnosis. However, throughout his childhood, we kept getting this push to have him diagnosed with autism so that he could receive services. So when we're talking about pigeonholing, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that we have allowed and shaped our industry to follow, really basically we were following the money, and the money was all about, let's take care of autism, let's research autism, let's fund autism, let's pass rules, regulations, and laws and create contracts now that only cover autism. And yet that's not where our science started. That's not where our science started. There's papers way back when working with individuals with schizophrenia, with other diagnoses. And so I think it's really important as an industry that we continue to explore and continue to publish and continue to advocate and be aware of services for individuals who do not have that autism diagnosis. I intentionally did not pursue that diagnosis for my child because I felt like it was not benefiting individuals who really did have autism to throw other diagnoses and other categories under that same umbrella. And fortunately for us, because of where we had lived at the time, it didn't matter. He was able to get services. But it's right now in the United States, we have EPSTD, which really says, hey, if this is going to benefit a kid, we have to fund it. And so it's important that our clinics recognize that. And if we have a clinic that specializes in a particular diagnosis or a particular service, that we also are aware of the clinics who don't specialize in that particular diagnosis, so that our families, our adults, our policymakers have other places to go whenever they're looking at forming policy. The more that we classify ourselves as specialists in this one little tiny area, the harder it will be for our industry to expand beyond that area, and the harder it is for people to get the services that they need, because the regulators are really looking at what we're doing. And if we're calling ourselves specialist in one teeny tiny thing and we're not advocating for those services for those other individuals and those other things that we know our science can do, we are actually harming our field by doing that. And I think, I look at my situation from a personal and professional viewpoint. And when I worked with families, I worked with families. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. If you go to the ABA Billing Coalition, they actually have a document that has a list of all the different diagnostic codes that ABA has been researched and has been found to be effective. And so when you have a funder, a organization, a policymaker telling you, no, you only can practice within this little box, I think it's important to go to those kinds of resources and say, look, the box is actually much bigger than what you're saying I can practice in.
Well, and how many times have we, as BCBAs, working with our clientele, dealt with insurance companies that have said, ooh, well, is that the autism or is that the mental health diagnosis? Where it's like, this is a person. Can we talk about the person and their needs instead of trying to siloing? We can't silo their diagnoses. They overlap, they interact. It has to be treated. End of story. I mean, how many times have I heard, well, you can't work on executive functioning because that's an ADHD thing and that has to be dealt with in counseling. And I'm like, point to me 5 counselors that know how to teach executive function to somebody on the spectrum, please. This shit has to stop. Like, it's just created barriers.
Yeah. And our science is about the behavior. We don't care. Our science does not care about the genetic makeup of someone. We don't care about the amount of gray matter somebody has, or the physiological things that are happening inside of their body. Our science is based on behavior.
Right.
And so I think it's important that that's what we look at and that's what we advocate for. This field is new. We're infants, and the way that we grow and develop is a direct result of how we parent and nurture that field. And by allowing other people to step into our house and say, well, this is how you're going to do it, you're really causing long-term harm.
Yeah. I definitely also see a greater systemic challenge that we have as a field between the research that's going on, what's disseminated, what gets funded, all of those things, and how does that translate into what we're doing? So it's almost like everyone has to work together on the whole spectrum of what it is that we're doing to make this thing work, because we have to have the research to lean on as well. We can't just say, oh, well, behavior is behavior. Every behavior, occurs in every person. And then you say, well, where is that in the research, right? And who's funding that research? And so people need to also get, passionate about expanding in that area as well, outside of just us as clinicians, in the clinic or in the school, out there, the people who are in academia also need to know what they're doing is impacting us every single day. and what they're not doing is also impacting us. So truly is a whole kind of systemic movement that needs to happen to kind of correct, maybe not correct because everything is kind of a progress, right? It's always in progress, but shift our direction. The pendulum is swinging the other way now, that we've gone so far in this one direction of just autism. We have to get the movement going into other areas as well.
Yeah,
So
I teach at a large university, and it's the foundations class for this large university. It's the entry level to get into the master's program in applied behavior analysis specialization. And the number of individuals that come into this course thinking that ASD and ABA are synonymous is mind blowing. It's crazy to me. I'm like, let's start here. Let's teach you that these do not mean the same thing.
yes, it's real, but it goes back to the story we are telling, right? And everything that we're promoting and everything that our research is talking about, like that's the story. And good storylines get passed on. So it's really like we have to take it upon ourselves to educate, tell the real story, and shift that awareness of people kind of at a larger scale, right? What are the areas that people are advocating for right now, and where do you kind of see the big next push in public policy?
I would say right now, CASP is doing a phenomenal job on creating clinician, I guess, created and standardized documentation templates. So that way, again, like there's just way too much variability from funder to funder on what they want in the documentation, like the craziest stuff that I am seeing, come out where it's like, well, the BCMA has to sign for the RBT's 5-3 session because they're supposed to read every note. And I'm like, I'm sorry, where does it say that in any of your documentation? That's wild to me because does the surgeon sign off on the anesthesiologist note? Because I don't think they do.
Yeah.
What? And so I think that's the next big push, standardization and documentation requirements and making it more focused on what's clinically relevant and meaningful rather than just checking random, seemingly random, I don't want to assume, but it's random, boxes. I mean, there's just some that there's just no common sense for it.
And my last question here, if you could magically change one public policy with no resistance and you just said, ta-da, here it is, what would it be?
Providers call the shots. The experts make the rules.
That's a great one. I love it.
You can limit me, and that's where I'm going.
Uncensored. Tell me what you feel.
I would really like to see there be federal accountability to evidence-based practices. I think that's a huge one. There's definitely a push from our industry to make things better and to do things better. There's also this push from the other side to allow access to services that are not evidence-based, that are not supported, and we're having to fight for the same policies, the same funding dollars. And to me, that is a huge issue. If we are spending federal dollars and creating federal laws to support these services, they need to be evidence-based practices.
Nice.
I have another one. I'm just going to keep going off.
Just you do it.
Let it all out.
Yes.
I would say that we are not immediately assumed to be opposition to other types of services, educational, whether it's other clinical, like we need to learn to play in the sandbox, but we also have to know when it's time to throw sand. That's Alex's famous quote that I'm stealing because I love it so much. I mean, but really, like, it's just this natural, immediate opposition when the behavior analyst enters the space. And I would love to see that just stop. Can we all just recognize that we are here for the good of the client and we all have meaningful things to contribute?
Absolutely. Yeah. I see that way too often. Like, I don't understand. Like, we're all on the same team. We're on team child, okay? Or team individual, right? And it's like, I don't understand why we all have to be in opposition. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So I appreciate that. So, if people want to be involved more in public policy, learn more, do all the things, get involved with you guys, how can they do that? What do you recommend?
Join your state association, participate in the public policy committee, identify what's important for your state, set goals, and be willing to put some effort into helping to communicate and tell the stories that need to be told to the people that need to hear it. It's not an impossible feat, and I think a lot of people feel like it's this huge beast and it's scary, and it's really not. Most of the time, when we have reached out to a legislator or a decision maker from a very collaborative, hey, we would just want to have a conversation and figure out how to solve this problem, we are met with open doors and open minds, and it becomes a really productive thing.
I have to say, and also don't be intimidated to reach out to our field's experts. They are incredibly generous with their time. I didn't know shit about public policy when I got started. I had the passion and I had the commitment and drive to learn. And I had a great mentor that got us kicked off as, Kawaba Public Policy. He gave us permission to start our own Medicaid subcommittee and really listen to what we wanted to do and pretty much pointed us in the direction and said, run. Like, don't be intimidated. Get in there. There are going to be people that are willing to help you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say the most important thing you can do is show up.
Yep.
I think, when you think about policy and public policy change, it's this big, huge national monster. But it starts with you and the decisions that you make. And then the very next step is just show up. Just go to some of these meetings, find out what's going on, throw in your 2 cents for whatever they're worth. Because as you do that, just being there, we know being there shapes behavior. So just show up.
Thank you for that. Great. Well, I will definitely have a bunch of links for all the listeners. Definitely you guys' paper, your website, and your shirts, because they're super cute and fancy. Thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate taking the time out to chat with us today. And I know that this will be forever beneficial for all behavior analysts, new, seasoned people who are fed up, to get out there and do something about it. So I really appreciate your guys' time.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's a wrap, y'all.
Look at that. Good job, team.